Good evening, everyone. My name is LA, and tonight I'm here with Natasha, Gabriella, Lloyd, and Jenny as Group 1, presenting on our proposed acquisition of Cineplex by Netflix. First, I'll go over our agenda. To start off, we're going to go over the current states of the Canadian movie theater industry, as well as the current situations of Netflix and Cineplex. Then we're going to go over potential targets and acquirers, as well as our acquisition rationale. We will then go over our valuation analyses for Cineplex and the proposal synergies. Finally, we will go over our deal structure and important things of note for our proposal. I will now pass it off to Gabriella for our initial overviews.
Thanks, LA. To start, I will talk about Canada's movie theater industry. The movie theater industry as a whole is in the mature stage of the industry life cycle since growth rates begin to slow down and market saturation has been reached. In Canada, the market size for the industry is approximately 3 billion Canadian dollars in 2020, with a projected CAGR of 4.1% in the next 5 years, after an average of 4.5% in the past 5 years, signifying a declining growth rate over time. However, the COVID-19 pandemic has greatly crippled the industry's performance in 2020, as most movie theaters across the country are temporarily closed or operate with a very limited capacity. Despite that, the industry is still expected to bounce back as households continue to view moviegoing as an inexpensive out-of-home entertainment activity, as well as many major blockbusters having been pushed to a 2021 or later release date. Moving on to Cineplex as our target. Cineplex is the largest movie theater operator in Canada, holding the largest market share at 75%, with the second largest player, Landmark, only holding 10%. So far, Cineplex has seen its revenue decrease by 92% in Q2 this year, its share price decreased by 70% year to date, and its current ratio decreased by 378% year to date, hitting a ratio of 0.09. However, their poor performance can mostly be attributed to the lockdowns, as the company was forced to close all its theaters in March and only began to reopen some theaters thereafter to a very limited capacity. Currently, Cineplex's strategy during the pandemic is to continue to reduce theater leasing and payroll costs to minimize net cash burn, as well as continue to safely reopen theaters. For the acquirer, we chose Netflix, which is the largest video streaming service company worldwide, with a global market share of 20%. The industry is currently in the growth stage of the industry life cycle. Over the past year, Netflix has seen its share price increase by 49%, with much of its growth attributed to the lockdowns as time spent indoors has greatly increased, spurring nearly 30 million new users for the platform this year. Currently, Netflix's core strategy of focusing and growing their Netflix originals content helps it stand apart from its competitors, as many of their original works, such as Stranger Things, continually draw new users onto the platform. Now, Natasha will talk about the potential targets and acquirers.
Thank you, Gabby. Moving on, we identified 3 global cinema chains as potential acquisition targets for Netflix. First, looking at AMC Theaters, its cash depletion makes it a viable alternative to Cineplex. However, AMC operates amidst a large number of US competitors. In contrast, Cineplex dominates the Canadian market with approximately a 75% market share. Thus, acquiring Cineplex would better allow Netflix to gain its footing in a less competitive market. For our next alternative, Cinemark has also been negatively impacted by COVID. However, its larger market capitalization would likely make it more costly for Netflix to acquire, given that this is its first cinema chain acquisition and a relatively new venture for Netflix. Cineplex is a better option. For our last alternative, Cineworld has a larger geographic reach than Cineplex, which could make it a more difficult transition for Netflix given the larger market. Cineworld has also recently secured new financing, which, along with its past acquisition deal with Cineplex, could signal that Cineworld might be less willing to sell. All in all, given that Cineplex is willing to sell, has potentially the cheapest price tag, and competes in the least competitive market, it is the best acquisition target for Netflix. As for alternative acquirers, we identified Walt Disney as a potential A-list alternative. Acquiring Cineplex would allow Disney to show their originals in theaters without needing to split box office revenues. However, given that Netflix is a pure-play film production and distribution company, An acquisition by Netflix would result in more focused and cleaner synergies. A B-list alternative to Netflix is Comcast. Given its recent dispute with AMC, acquiring Cineplex seems like a viable strategy to prevent similar obstacles in the future. However, Comcast has recently signed deals with AMC, Cineplex, and Cinemark to shorten its theatrical window. Therefore, it might not be necessary for them to acquire Cineplex. Lastly, we identified Apple as a potential C-list alternative. Since the launch of a streaming service, Apple has begun to produce its own original movies. However, Apple is an unlikely buyer due to their relatively new presence in the film production industry. With a limited number of original titles, Apple's acquisition success would be contingent on whether it can compete in the film production and streaming service industries. For these reasons, Netflix is the ideal acquirer of Cineplex. I will now pass it on to LA.
Thanks, Natasha. For our acquisition rationale, first and most importantly, the Paramount Decrees, which since 1948 has prohibited movie producers from owning and operating movie theaters, was just recently repealed by the US DOJ. This law change now fully allows Netflix to acquire and integrate movie theaters into their vertically integrated model, producing revenue synergies through cross-selling opportunities, such as freely showing Netflix originals in theaters. Cost synergies are also incurred through discounted showing rights and resource sharing between both platforms. Furthermore, a core strategy of Netflix is to focus on their Netflix originals content and continually attract subscribers through top content. A big part of that is winning awards. The Academy Awards rules indicate that films must be shown in theaters for a set amount of time to qualify for awards. While it's true that Netflix has already been showing their content in theaters, sometimes their negotiations don't work, as just last November, Cineplex rejected Netflix's bid to show The Irishman in Cineplex's theaters. Therefore, Netflix operating their own theaters would ensure they would always qualify for these prestigious awards. For our evaluation of Cineplex, I'm firstly going to go over our assumptions. Since this year is highly abnormal for Cineplex due to COVID, we decided to have three main components for our forward assumptions. First, we analyzed 3 prior years from 2017 to 2019 to get a sense of their regular operations. We then used the weighted average of the 3 years as assumptions with a larger weight for the most recent, non-COVID affected year of 2019. Second, we took into account the government's current quarterly vaccination schedule for 2021. Vaccinations range from only for prioritized groups starting in Q1 to the majority of Canadians being vaccinated from Q3 onwards. Third, and finally, we gauged quarterly movie-going demand for the coming year through looking at the upcoming box office releases. In particular, the most hyped releases such as Black Widow and Top Gun 2 have been taken into account. Ultimately, these 3 components formed our forward assumptions. Now, I'll go over our DCF valuation. As can be seen on our model, we carved up our forecasted periods from quarter 1, 2021 to quarter 4, 2022 into 3 periods: the ongoing COVID period denoted by red, the COVID recovery period denoted by yellow, and the post-COVID period denoted by green. The periods for our base model is a conservative outlook of the aforementioned vaccination schedule announced by the government. Then, using our calculated RWAC of 7.11%, long-term terminal value growth of 3.5%, and aforementioned forward assumptions, we calculated Cineplex's share price to be $14.15. The calculations for our bear case model was then made by lengthening the COVID period, downgrading our revenue and movie-going demand assumptions, and lowering long-term growth rate, netting a lower bound share price of $11.06. Finally, the opposite was done for the bull case model, netting an upper bound share price of $18.57. For our synergies calculations, as mentioned earlier, there will be revenue and cost synergies through our acquisition pitch. Cineplex's box office and media revenues, on average, make up around 40% of their total revenues. Our revenue synergies through cross-selling helps with these revenues, increasing quarterly revenues by up to 5%. Meanwhile, film and showing rights costs make up around 20% of total costs. Our cost synergies through resource sharing and saving on show rights will help with these costs, lowering quarterly costs by up to 4%. These synergies are then phased in gradually throughout our forecast period, with cost synergies having slightly quicker phase-in rates due to their simpler implementation. Finally, we use the same RWAC of 7.11% and apply the perpetuity formula for our terminal value, and our DCF model yielded a synergies per share of $6.48. I will now pass it off to Natasha to talk about our multiple analyses.
Thank you, LA. Moving on to our multiples valuation. We used 2 different multiples to value Cineplex, using other global cinema chains as comparable companies. By our enterprise value over revenue multiples valuation, we generated an implied share price ranging from $7.54 to $26.84. By our market value of equity over book value of equity multiples valuation, we generated an implied share price ranging from $7.36 to $10.08. We excluded AMC from our MV over BV of equity multiples valuation because of its negative book value of equity. I will now pass it on to Gabby, who will talk more about our share price offer.
Thank you, Natasha. To obtain our offer price, we used the football field valuation method. On top of the DCF and multiple valuation, we added the 52-week high and low and 7 analysts forecast of Cineplex's target price in the next 12 months. By taking the weighted average of the different valuation methods, we arrived at an offer price of $15.7 per share, which is a 38.8% premium from the current share price of $11.31. The weights were distributed based on the level of relevance and accuracy, with the most weight going to the DCF valuation since it is the most comprehensive, and the least weight going to the 52-week high and low valuation method. Natasha will now talk about the deal structure.
Thanks, Gabby. Given Cineplex's willingness to sell, evident by their previous deal with Cineworld, we propose a friendly all-cash offer of $15.7 per share. Netflix should acquire 100% of Cineplex's shares to gain full control over operations, which we believe is possible due to their acceptance of Cineworld's past acquisition offer. By acquiring 100%, Netflix's total offer would equate to $1.01 billion, which includes a 38.8% premium. However, although we will open our proposal with a $15.7 offer, Netflix should be willing to go as high as $17.5 per share. With a total offer of $1.11 billion, it offers a 55% premium to Cineplex, while still allowing Netflix to capture all of the expected synergies. Jenny will now talk about the due diligence issues in this acquisition.
Thanks, Natasha. Netflix should conduct its due diligence investigation from 3 dimensions: strategic, financial, and operational. For the strategic part, Netflix should validate Cineplex synergies in the post-merger integration to evaluate its commercial attractiveness. It should also evaluate Cineplex customer engagement after the deal to assess its market share. For the financial aspect, a thorough audit of Cineplex financial statements is crucial in determining the accurate number of aggregate revenues and costs. For instance, Netflix needs to know which accounting treatment the target uses to depreciate its PPE compared to its peers and the logic behind the estimates. Another point worth noting is Cineplex contingent liabilities. Due to the pandemic, the target is running out of cash and may raise money from other sources. Since this information may not be publicly available, Netflix would need to do a further investigation to gain a better assessment on Cineplex debt obligations and other liabilities. In regards to operational due diligence, a due diligence team should conduct random on-site visits and check the attendance rates to verify the reported box office revenue and food service revenues. Netflix should also take into account the government policy on reopening movie theaters amid the pandemic. Under COVID circumstances, Cineplex future earnings are highly subject to the policies, and Netflix should prepare for the future uncertainties and take this factor into the pricing. Next, Lloyd is going to talk about possible issues and remedies.
Thanks, Jenny. Now for potential issues Netflix may face, we identified 3 important issues that need to be addressed: antitrust, legal, and regulatory. First, with antitrust issues, the acquisition of Canada's largest movie chain can raise some questions as to whether this would further separate Cineplex from its competition. As a reference, Cineplex currently makes up 75% of the Canadian movie theater industry, whereas the second largest one, Landmark, has only 10% market share. However, Netflix can provide both structural and behavioral remedies. A structural remedy may look something like Netflix divesting some of Cineplex's theaters to its competitors. A behavioral remedy could be where Netflix allows other movie theaters to show their originals after a certain number of days from debuting on its own theaters. Moving on to legal issues, the Canadian government may investigate into the acquisition under the Investment Canada Act. Netflix may be questioned if the investment would be beneficial for the Canadian market. By further pushing Cineplex ahead of its competitors, this may force many independent theaters to go bankrupt, which can be seen as a potential threat to the overall Canadian economy. However, because of the ongoing pandemic, the movie theater industry has been struggling, including Cineplex. With an over-leveraged balance sheet and a sharp decline in its customer base, Cineplex is on the brink of bankruptcy and may become insolvent. With Netflix in the picture, they can help deal with their debt, and because of Cineplex's large market share, helping the company can have a positive influence and help revive the Canadian movie theater industry. Finally, there's the regulatory issue. Because both firms are in the entertainment industry, there will be back office consolidation issues due to the post-acquisition integration. Although there will be cost synergies between the two firms, the merger can create duplications of several teams internally. This will lead to a reduction in the number of employees, and Netflix would face the risk of losing valuable human capital. However, Netflix can mitigate this risk through good management, which would include retaining the top talents while reducing costs by cutting off duplicated departments. So overall, although there are risks, they are very minimal and can easily be mitigated through remedies. Thank you for listening to our pitch. We will now open the floor for questions.